This is the Soul-Filled Sisterhood podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole Burgess, licensed marriage and family therapist and an empowerment mentor for women. The information shared in this podcast is not a substitute, nor is it to convey professional, psychological, financial, or medical advice. If you could use such services, please seek them out from someone you trust. Now here is today's episode. Well, welcome, sisters. I am so excited about this upcoming conversation. My guest today is Ashton Applewhite, and she is the author of This Chair Rocks, a manifesto against ageism. She is an internationally recognized expert on ageism, and she speaks widely at venues that have included the TED Main Stage and United Nations. She has written for Harper's, The Guardian, and the New York Times, and she is the voice of Yo, Is This Ageist? Which I love her blog. Ashton is a leading spokesperson for emerging movement against discrimination on the basis of age. Ms. Magazine called her previous book, Cutting Loose, Why Women Who End Their Marriages Do So Well, quote, rocket fuel for launching their new lives, end of quote. Well, Ashton, I just want to say thank you so much for being on today. I'm so excited about our conversation.
I'm delighted to be speaking with you.
Well, I actually heard you on a whole different podcast, which led me down a rabbit hole, finding out more about you and the work you were doing and this mission that you were on to really, for all of us, to raise our awareness and to really end this whole ageism stuff that is going on. So share with us a little more, like, how did you even come about really writing this book?
Oh, believe me, I didn't want to write another book. Writing a book is the worst. If you're even thinking about it, think twice. No, just kidding. But you have to really, really, really want to wake up in the morning knowing you have to write that thing. I was afraid of getting old in hindsight. I was in my mid-50s. I didn't have a big project to be working on. And it started as a project about older people who work, inspired by my in-laws and a question people kept asking them. They were in their 80s at the time. So when are you going to retire? Mm-hmm. So it started as a blog with the brilliantly original name of sowhenareyougonnaretire.com. And I started interviewing older workers who were a dime a dozen, and not just artists and lawyers, but also, janitors and cashiers and everything you can imagine. And, it didn't surprise me that they were in the world in all sorts of interesting ways, but I also started to research longevity, and it just knocked my socks off. How little what I thought I knew about what it would be like to be that old was accurate. Mm-hmm. And I abandoned the older workers angle because it's intuitively obvious why work is good for us. Mm-hmm. And floundered for a couple of miserable years. But I remember saying to myself, if all I get out of this, and it's a lot, is that I feel so much better about my own later years, that may have to be enough. But, when just your opening comments just inspired this. I mean, I'm always smiling when I talk about this stuff, because when you start to see how misinformed we are, how brainwashed by the culture, and it's like sort of like the Wizard of Oz. See the little guy behind the curtain. It's not a little guy. It's a ton of powerful economic and social forces. But see that there are these forces at work. It's so liberating. Yeah. And even if you don't want to become an age activist, God forbid, because the world would be intolerable if it was full of activists, you start to feel so liberated from your own narrow assumptions, I think. Now, you just read the book, so why don't you tell me whether that was your experience, and let me not speak for you.
Yeah, it absolutely was. So before I hit the record button, I was telling Ashton, I was like, again, no one can see me because this is a podcast, but I showed her my book, a copy that I have, and I got all these little sticky notes all over the place and going, oh my gosh, I used to think that. I used to say that. I'm not doing that anymore. So there's a ton of ahas that, again, raising the awareness and starting to shift how we're thinking about getting older and what it means to be older.
Yeah. I mean, and there's, any author will tell you there is no greater compliment. I mean, it's a very dense book, but it's fun to read. I mean, there's a lot of stories in it, and no one expects an activist to have a sense of humor. You can be the judge of whether or not you think I'm funny. But I think a manifesto sounds like it's all going to be fiber, and there's a lot of fiber, but it's easy to chew.
It absolutely is. And yeah, it's funny, even just the thinking that manifesto is more fiber, because to me, you did a beautiful job of weaving both the personal stories along with the research in this book. Again, really busting so many of these myths.
Thank you.
Yeah, what it means to get older. And I mean, there's so many myths that are out there. But before we dive into that, would you mind just kind of sharing what your definition that you work with regarding what is ageism, what you mean by that?
The dictionary definition is stereotyping and prejudice on the basis of age. We are being ageist anytime we assume anything about a person or a group of people based on how old we think they are. And I think it's really important to understand that this affects young people too, in the sense of, children. I mean, kids are like that. How could you're not old enough to be, to be my manager. How could you possibly be experienced? I mean, the older I get, I have to say, the younger everyone seems, which I'm sure is an ageist and terrible thing to say. But of course, by the time my niece she's finishing her second year of medical residency, and maybe because she's a family member, she seems incredibly young to me. And if she showed up at my bedside, I'm sure my first thought would be, wow, she's so young, perhaps, but I know what an amazing doctor she is. So anytime we have an assumption about anyone on the basis of age, we are being ageist.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
And an important point about that is that as we age, we grow more different from one another.
Yes.
Every 7-year-old is different from each other, of course, but they're so much more alike developmentally, socially, physically than 27-year-olds, who are way more alike than 57-year-olds, and so on. So all prejudice relies on stereotyping. All stereotyping is, of course, wrong and dumb. How could anything possibly be true of a whole generation?
Right.
But especially when it comes to age. The older a person is, the less their age says about them.
Yes. Oh, very well said. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, would you mind sharing just a little bit? I know in your book, again, I talk about, you've got so many different chapters where it talks about, again, these myths of our healthcare cost increase due to, people being older. It's, there
no evidence for that.
Yes. And you prove that over and over and over in your book. And I was amazed by some of the statistics.
I mean, it's always tricky. It's always complicated. Any honest person will tell you it's complicated. It is perfectly true that we accrue most medical costs at the end of our lives.
Correct.
And it is true that most of us are lucky enough to die when we are on the older side than the younger side. Thank God. But that is true whether or not you die at 18 or at 80, A.
Yes.
And B, the main driver of those increased costs, those high costs, is the increasingly technological nature of medicine, not the fact that there are more old people than ever before.
Yes. That was it. That was some of the stuff when you were talking about it in the book. I was like, oh yeah, now that makes total sense. But here in our States, and I know you talk quite a bit about it in the US, how we are so, I want to say, more prejudiced towards the youthful look, towards this. So we really feed into the fears of getting older and having more wrinkles or gray hair or whatever it may be, that really compounds all of these myths.
Well, the US is the epicenter of pop culture, and pop culture is very much youth driven. And also the US is a hyper capitalist society. Buy. Tons of things are not regulated the way they are in Europe because the corporate profits honestly drive so much of our policy. And think a good analogy here is the body acceptance movement. There's not much evidence that any of those programs to help you diet or stay thin do much effect. And if we have much effect, and if we learn to say, it is not the end of the world that my thighs rub together, which when I was 15, I really did think was the end of the world.
Yep.
I mean, it just plagued me. Guess what? If we learn to accept ourselves, no one's going to make money off us.
Mm-hmm.
If we think that wrinkles are the most awful thing in the world, then if we can afford it, and of course there is a huge class bias behind all of this that usually goes unaddressed because these remedies are expensive, gyms, personal trainers,
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff. If we can be persuaded that our wrinkles are the end of the world, then we can be persuaded to use Botox or have plastic surgery. And if we can be persuaded that the natural transitions of age are a sign of disease, are pathologized, and I'm not saying that people don't have perimenopausal symptoms or that, and obviously, osteoporosis, that happens to be my ailment. Those are real ailments.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, they should be ignored, but when they are pathologized, when you can't remember the name of the movie that you saw last week with what's her name, there's a name for that. It's mild cognitive impairment, which may or may not be a thing. And it may or may not be a precursor to dementia. But usually, like almost all the time, it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can be persuaded that if you buy this supplement or do this brain game, that you will somehow, or do some sort of physical thing, exercise is important. You can't stop aging.
Yeah.
You may slow certain aspects of physical decline, which is fantastic. But your body is not betraying you just because it's changing. And if we can say, gee, my thighs rub together, but I still found someone to love me, hopefully, or whatever, no one, people don't flee when they see me walking down the beach. I can be just fine with this and not torture myself with liposuction or diets or bogus remedies.
Yes. Well, and I love that. It's so much about what you really talk about in this book too, is that self-acceptance. It also advocating for yourself.
Yeah. And hello, ladies. Most of my readership and audiences are women. Guess who the harshest critics of women's bodies are? Other women. Let's just try. I just read something where a woman said about an editorial, it was this fantastic editorial in the opinion section of the New York Times yesterday. I want to put it up on social media, criticizing the whole wellness industry as just the diet industry reconfigured and saying, ladies, could we just agree to not say anything critical of our appearances or the appearances of anyone at the table? That shouldn't be such a radical ask.
You even talk about it towards the end of the book too, about working together versus, I think, end or the middle of the book, but instead we pit different groups against one another. And this whole thing about being inclusive. And I know Brene Brown talks about that as well, about when we actually get to know the other human being, there's where that power and strength is.
Hugely. I mean, it's incredibly gratifying. And, this is not always easy. If I have friends of all ages, but I've gotten in the habit. So it seems easy to me. If it were easy to have friends of all races, my house would look like the Rainbow Coalition, and it's pretty damn white. This requires effort and going out of our comfort zones. But the idea that age itself is a barrier to having stuff in common is just nuts. It is a function of how age segregated our society is. I just came back from a week in London promoting the British edition of my book. And granted, this, I was going to call him a kid, and then I caught myself. This very young man is a medical student who had found my book and written me about ageism. So we had something in common. But he came to one of my talks in London, and we went out for beers, and we just, he said, I feel like I've known you forever.
Wow.
And it was just easy, and that's despite, what was it, a 44-year age difference? It just didn't matter.
Yeah.
Sometimes it does. You will not hear me saying age doesn't matter. Age is just a number. It is not just a number. It is a very real thing. Age is different from youth, but the idea is to acknowledge and recognize the advantages and disadvantages of every stage of life. And as you pointed out, not let people pit us against each other on the basis of age or anything else, because that's what prejudice does. The issue is not, you see it a lot around the political conversation now. So-and-so is too old to be president. Let's get rid of all these old white guys. The issue is not age or race or gender. The issue is privilege. The underlying issue is inequality. Regardless of what color people are who you sleep with or how old you happen to be, there would be enough to go around if it were shared more equitably. So do not fall for old versus young ways of thinking. It's a trap.
Yes. And you even talk about, again, this is more towards the end of it, where this myth that we have, especially here in the US, we're all about that self-reliance, and I can totally fall into that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not about it. There's a healthy interdependence that we do need to ask for help. And this is all part of it. Again, when we keep people like at a distance, if it's their age, their race, whatever, we miss out on so much. And you talk so much about, really being intentional of getting to know other people, getting to look at these services, having, difficult conversations with those that you love and your friends, so that as you continue to get older, you've got some things already in place versus waiting till you are in the ICU, if that were to happen, and going, oh crap, I don't have anything set up.
Or worst case, can't talk for yourself.
Yes.
There's a beautiful quote in the book by a Dutch gerontologist named Jan Bars: autonomy requires collaborators.
Yes.
Right? If I had a magic wand, a lot of stuff would be different. One of the little things that would be different would be that independent would be struck from the entire conversation around aging, because no one is ever independent. When do you need arguably the most number of conversations about who's going to help you with stuff? If you have little children, or if you are, looking after someone else, you of course don't have to be a parent, but if you have responsibility for somebody else, if you're juggling, 2 jobs, if you don't happen to be rich enough to hire people to do crap for you, we are all interdependent in a million ways. As we age, there are only 2 inevitable bad things about getting older. One is that people you've known all your life are going to die. And the other is some part of your body is going to fall apart. That's a given. You may not necessarily cognitively, but we do need to ask for more help, even if it's just with schlepping and, carrying and perhaps driving at night, that kind of stuff. But we needed help with those things lifelong. And those conversations should be stripped of shame and acknowledged as two-way things. People are happy to help.
Yeah, you pointed that out so beautifully in the book too, about whether it was asking somebody to help carry down some bags through these steps when you were traveling. And I remember so many different times when I've traveled, or I've asked somebody to help me maybe put the bag up above because I just for some reason could not lift it that day. And then other times people ask me, I'm like, oh, absolutely sure. Like there is such an ease with that give and take, and yet there can be shame, like somehow I'm supposed to be able to do all of it all the time. And it's like, no. Can't go.
And it's so American.
Yeah.
It's so American. It is one area where our culture really doesn't help us. I mean, I don't have to force myself to ask anymore, but I did in the beginning. I'm like, what am I waiting for? Yes, you could wrestle your suitcase down the stairs or up into the luggage rack, but you really want to wait till you actually hurt your back doing it?
Right.
What's the practice?
Yeah. And it's funny, I grew up with the message of don't ask for help, just do it yourself. And it's really challenging myself when I come up to that block in my own mind of like, oh no, that's somehow I just need to know how to do this and I need to do it all. And as a business owner, it's like, yeah, you can't do it all. You have people on your team.
And think of it also this is true of 10,000 other things I'm sure we'll now cover in the next 20 minutes, but it's not a binary.
Yes.
You don't go from mobile to immobile. You don't go from not needing help to needing help, right?
Yes.
That's why it's good to get in the habit of asking. I mean, one of the first questions I got on Yo, Is This Ageist, which I should point out is a question and answer blog. So you can send in something you've seen or heard or done and ask me whether it's ageist. It's a harder question to answer than you might think a lot of the time. My main website is thischairrocks.com, and if you click on blog there, you will be taken to my main serious blog. Not that Yo, Is This Ageist isn't serious, but I've been talking and thinking about all this out loud in blog form. So, and that's like tons of material searchable by topic. Just to say, I mean, but one of the first questions I got to Yo, Is This Ageist when I started it was someone being upset that someone had offered them a seat on the bus.
Oh yes.
And, that was honestly really, really hard one to answer. But the reason we are angry when someone offers us a seat on the bus, which is a generous, thoughtful thing to do. I do advise people not to, jump to your feet like Sir Galahad and make a big show of it. This is true of offering anyone assistance of any sort. Don't grab a blind person's elbow.
Right.
Don't yell in an old person's ear and assume they're deaf. A friend of mine got her head bitten off for doing that. For what was a kind offer on her part, right? But just say, would you like a seat? When we're angry at being offered a seat, it's because we're afraid that we look old or, unstable on our feet, perhaps enough to need it. And guess what? You do. And guess what? So will everyone else who lives long enough, is lucky to live long enough. Why should getting older be shameful?
Right.
That it is our own internalized ageism, by which I mean that we are all ageist. We have all been bombarded by negative messages about life from Disney cartoons and children's books on out. We older people are the most ageist of all. That was another shocking thing for me to learn because we've had a lifetime of it and most of us haven't thought to challenge it.
Right.
So that anger comes from your own shame, if that's happened to you, and perhaps you evolved, and more power to you. We each have to do this in our own way and at our own time. But a society that says aging is shameful, aging is failure, it is shameful to be called out as old. That's why we need to change society with the grassroots movement, but that movement starts between our own ears.
Correct. You have there's a beautiful quote, and it's part of your chapter, the talk about the bull looks different.
Yeah, I love that.
Because that imagery really stuck in my mind. I know you got this from a different person. But it's like, as you get up to this specific, whatever, developmental stage, this age, whatever, and now you're in this moment, it's like, oh, what I used to think is no longer true for me because now it's changed. I'm in this moment. It's different.
Yeah. And the bull looks different was a phrase I heard, it was over a decade ago when I didn't really know how important it would become to me, but that's often the case. I'm sort of a backwards learner. I was on a journalism trip to Johns Hopkins, and we were spoken to by a bioethicist named Thomas Finucane. And he talked about how his mantra was a Mexican saying that the appearance of the bull changes when you enter the ring. It looks different when you're the matador, right? And psychologists have a different word for it. They call it the psychologist's fallacy, the idea that you can ever know what another person is experiencing and feeling. You can't. There's a funny anecdote about that in the book by a geriatric psychiatrist who works at this huge retirement home, old people's place in Miami. And this woman came in and she was in her 90s and she'd been married for like 70 some years and she'd just been widowed. He's like, I'm so sorry about your loss. And she says, not in these words, but she said, he was a tyrant and finally I am free. And he was like, oops. And, but I don't mean to make light of this. It's a beautiful idea in that we can never know what another person's experience is in a society that fears aging and turns away from physical disability, right? And idolizes perfection. When we see a very old person using a walker, moving very slowly, most of us say, I used to say it myself, put me out of my misery before I get like that, right? Oh, that person's quality of life must be terrible. And guess what? The bull looks different. Ask a person with severe disabilities whether their life is worth living, and odds are they'll say yes. Especially if you've had a lifetime of coming to terms with it. People with disabilities are radical spirits there will assure you that their disability is integral to who they are. They are not ashamed of it. And their life is very much worth living. So be careful of projecting your fears. There's a saying that very few people want to live to be 100, and most of them are in their late 90s. We adapt. It's not a binary. You don't wake up old one day and everything is awful and nothing works. We adapt, which is gorgeous. There are losses. There are also gains. And life for the vast, vast, vast majority of us remains living right up to the end.
And you've hit upon a point. I know you talk about it in the book. And one of my previous podcast guests, she has a chronic illness, and she talked quite a bit about, and so did the example you gave in your book, about sometimes you just need to grieve, you need to grieve the loss of what you had. versus where you are right now in your life. And as you give yourself permission to grieve that shift, that change, that loss, as you're saying, it's like you're embracing life now in a different way because this is the reality of where you are.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, okay, so I used to say this to myself and it's like, yeah, no, that's no longer true.
Yeah, it's different. And, I mean, I still ride a bicycle around New York, but I got mine out of the basement yesterday, the day before, because it finally stopped raining for a day. It's raining now, but still, I noticed now maybe I'm just out of shape or stiff, but I had to lean against a car in order. It was my son's bike and then my stepson's bike, so it's a boy's bike, and in order to swing my leg up over the bar.
That bar, yeah.
And I was like, oh crap, and maybe that's the new normal, and I don't like it. But maybe I can exercise my way out of it. Ha ha ha. But if that's what it takes to get up on my bike, then I'll adapt. And it's not that these changes aren't real, and it's not that we should not talk about them. I mean, there's a lot of activity around positive aging, which is fine. I mean, it's very important that we realize that this narrative of it's all going to be awful is false and is bad for us. But it's also not true that you can happy attitude your way out of these issues. We also need to address the social and economic systems that benefit from them and challenge them, because, attitude, it's that we're back to independence. That's sort of like your attitude is responsible for how well or how badly you are aging. I say everyone ages successfully if you wake up in the morning.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the avenues to kind of go backward in the book too, one thing that you talked about again is even in our healthcare field, how some of the research, and I know for women, it used to be many of the studies were done strictly on men.
Oh yeah.
And they're finding out how some of the medications, interact differently in women's bodies and things. And even now you're saying for older adults, there's a whole different interaction with how things are absorbed or not absorbed. And that if you're not mindful or aware of how some of these medications, like you've talked about in here, can actually cause what looks like delusions or some, forgetfulness. And it could be because you're over medicated or the medication.
Yeah. I mean, and that intersects with sexism too, because most of the people in nursing, most older people are women. There are people who believe that what we used to call senility, syndromes affecting the elderly, or are largely an effect of over-medication. I don't know if that's true. I've heard smart people say that. The fact is that, of course, older people take the vast majority of medications, which I would like to point out is not all because of all these evil diseases of old age, which exist. Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, arthritis, they're evil. They are the diseases of old age. But many of the things older people take meds for are conditions that started in childhood.
Yeah.
Right? That simply didn't become symptomatic until you were older. So again, just watch that reflexive tendency to blame it on, oh, I'm old, right? And so people take many more drugs, and no one studies the drug interactions. Yeah. And none of the research isn't funded, partly because of ageism. No one cares about old people. I'm overstating it. And also, guess what? The more drugs you take, the more money Big Pharma makes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's true. That's not me being, an anarchist nut to say that. They want you to take lots of drugs. Right. That's why there's no research on weaning yourself off drugs.
Yeah.
The effects of going off antidepressants, antipsychotic medications. People have to do it on their own because there's no literature, because the last thing the drug companies want to do is fund research in helping you take less of what they're selling.
Yep. And again, this is so powerful in that when we have this awareness and we come together, both men and women, this is how we can make the changes to the legislation and to the research that is done, and where the advocacy comes into play to say, hey, enough, because we do have an aging society. We're all getting older every single day. And it's like, it's not going to stop. It's not going to just magically disappear. This is part of it.
Right. And that's one of my bugaboos is how we use the word aging to describe parents or celebrities, as an adjective, when the adjective should be older in those contexts, because everyone is aging. It is not just something annoying that old people do.
Right. Yeah, I guess the way you just stated that makes me laugh in the sense that, I've worked with little kids in my therapy practice, and I work with adults in my coaching practice. And it's funny because I'm like, yeah, I'd say to tell them we're all aging. I mean, it's like, it doesn't matter what your age is. Every day you're old.
No. And I use the words olders and youngers as nouns in my book because I literally got tired of typing older person or older American. And I realized it worked, and now my friends use it, and I'm putting it out in the world. And one of the nice things about it, it's value neutral. It emphasizes that age is a spectrum, right? Because so it gets you around that, I hope I'm not old, aversion. And people who will not be happy describing themselves as old will very readily often say, yeah, I'm older, right? So it's a way to start to get off that denial hamster wheel.
Yeah.
But also, and this is something I just realized, just really a month or so ago, even though I've been using the term for a long time, we're olders and youngers at the same time.
Yes.
Right? A 4-year-old will assure you that she is older than her 3-year-old sister, right? And so we age in relation all along.
Yes. Very well said. Yeah. And
and Mrs. McGillicuddy at the senior home will assure you that she is younger than Mrs. Kravitz down the hall, who's 103.
Yep. Very true. It's funny you even bring that up because I've got various people from 3 to 4 to the 90s and 100s that I've heard them say that, and it's like, oh yeah, yep. But I'm not that older yet. Yeah.
Although you have to wonder whether that sentiment comes out of internalized ageism.
Yes.
Is it still the assumption that the older you are, the badder it is, and therefore I'm going to be like less, insert bad word, by proving that I'm not the oldest. It's all tricky, but that's why it's so fun to think about.
Right. Again, this whole point is the curiosity of stuff. Instead of making it, like you said, the either or situation, it's the both and
always.
Yeah. And as we go further into that, stay curious about having the dialogue, which again makes each one of us more and more human versus somehow I'm so different. And as you talk about being intentional with creating friendships, relationships with people that are actually chronologically younger than you and chronologically older than you.
Right. I got a great letter over the weekend from, I love this, a business manager of a curling and golf club in Alberta, Canada, who is saying that it drives her nuts that they're always campaigning for younger members. And why can't they get the message that age is not actually a very important criterion? And one idea I came up with, and I've gotten some people to do it, is instead of saying we want younger members or younger whatever, give a prize or whatever, a door prize or a shout out to, when you have an event, to the person who brings another person with the biggest age gap.
Ooh.
Right?
Nice.
Right, because it could be older, could be younger.
Yes.
Family's cheating, by the way. You can't just drag your mom and cop that door prize. But, it is, the other bad thing about getting older is that it's true. Old friends die. And old as in, both ways, friends we've known all our lives. And, it is one reason, interdependence, we are going to need more help with the physical things. It is not ageist to say that young people are better at shoveling snow than really old people,
right.
Or carrying heavy things. That's just true. Right. So, and, especially, if you don't have biological family, I mean, the whole idea that, your family, specifically, generally your daughter, so it's women who shoulder, men do a lot of caregiving, but it's women who do most of it, unpaid, etc., cast a wide net, so that, and especially, of course, not everyone has a kid. Not everyone has kids. Not everyone gets along with their kids. Not everyone's kids live close enough to shovel the driveway. So the more friends we have of all ages, the easier it is for us to get the kind of help we need on the terms that we can negotiate, right? And it also prevents social isolation, which is the biggest threat to a good old age. Not health, which is what I would have thought. And then I thought, well, must be wealth. It's not health or wealth. It's having a solid social network.
And I have a friend of mine. I have two really dear friends that I met. It's probably now been over a decade that I met them. And they are 15 years older than me. And I just absolutely love the relationship that we have. And one of my friends has some true physical limitations, and it continues to get worse as she gets older. And that's just due to genetics. It's a genetic thing that she has. Anyways, our other friend actually talked about, she was so, I thought, creative in this. She's like, well, what would happen if you actually had somebody live on your property that would help you care for the animals, that you could still do what you love to do, but also not put your body so at risk to manage it?
Yeah, I mean, the whole aging in place conversation is huge.
Mm-hmm.
Shocker, it's double-edged. For a lot of people, aging in place is a recipe for pretending nothing's going to change.
Mm-hmm.
The same goes, for that matter, to something you sort of touched on in passing, but conversations about what we want at the end of our lives. Mm-hmm. People act like there's always going to be time for that conversation until something does happen.
Right.
And then everyone's in a crisis. Mm-hmm. And the person who's most affected might be unable to talk, and you're wishing you could read their mind, right? Mm-hmm. Staying in your house, there's a geriatrician named Bill Thomas who does wonderful work, and he says, aging in place is fine if it means aging in community.
Yes.
So if you have a family moving in downstairs, fantastic. If you have enough money to subsidize people who are going to come in and talk to you and hang out with you and shovel that proverbial driveway, mm-hmm. fantastic. But if you don't have that, and it takes money and it takes planning ahead of time, mm-hmm. it is a recipe for isolation, and that is really bad for you.
Yeah. Well, the way that my friend has her kind of set up now is just a beautiful relationship, and you hit upon it. There is connection, there's, communication, there's that community, and it became a win-win through that relationship. And it's fun to watch her. She continues to get to do what she loves, but not at any risk of injuring herself, because she can overdo it. So.
Right. And there's benefit, to the younger people as well. Yeah. We tend to think, and the same is true if you're sick, if you have a disability, I'm a burden. Mm-hmm. This is one way. They're just helping me, and I'm not, it's not binary.
Correct.
These conversations and friendships are hugely enriching to the younger people as well. I mean, one of the things I really want, I'm next up is I have a consciousness raising guide mm-hmm. to starting a consciousness raising group around age bias on my website, okay. thischairrocks.com/resources. It's a free download called Who Me Ageist. And it's also available along with tons of other stuff on a site I started with two colleagues called oldschool.info, Old School, which is a clearinghouse of all different kinds of free anti-ageist resources. Just want people to know about that. Everything's free except the books. But I want to adapt the consciousness raising guide for women, because you just know that if more older women had younger friends, mm-hmm. we would be more generous, mm-hmm. right? We would remember how hard it is to be old. And if more younger women had older friends, they would be less afraid of aging. They would see how many ways we come into our power as we age. Mm-hmm. And most of all, we would stop this competition to look young and act young, which is the competition that feeds patriarchy and sexism. That's why the wage gap no one's fixing the wage gap, because companies make money from it. Mm-hmm. And as long as women are busy arguing about who's younger or sexier or a better mother or whatever, we're never going to combine forces to close the wage gap so women can choose whether or not to stay home, right? So we women need to come together and talk about how age is socially constructed, which is a fancy word for saying it's made up.
Yes.
Right? It's made up. We can unmake it. We can make different ideas. I mean, look at the places where aging is venerated, right? These are made up ideas like fashion, right? We can unmake them. We can make new ones. And consciousness raising is the super powerful tool that does that.
Absolutely. Well, Ashton, I just want to say thank you so much for being on. I was, I didn't say this before we recorded, but I was thinking this. I'm like, I'm such a fangirl because of what you were doing. And it was funny because I was getting so nervous about this conversation with you. And it's just been such a lovely conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time. And Ladies, I'm going to have all of her social media links and everything on the show notes. And again, her website and what she was talking about, these other websites too, I will put on the show notes. It will be there for you. So Ashton, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. A movement needs a million voices, and I am very glad yours is one of them.
Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, I invite you to go out to iTunes and please leave an honest rating and review. In the podcast world, this really helps other women find the podcast and they can see if it resonates with others out there. So I really appreciate all your support and leaving me a rating.